Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate our second panel on emerging challenges and remaining opportunities looking forward. And we have a fantastic panel today of advocates and religious leaders and representatives here from the Department of Justice. So without further ado, the first person I'd like to introduce is Professor Sahar Aziz of the University of Texas Wesleyan Law School. Sahar is a graduate of the University of Texas Arlington, where she earned her BS, a master's from the University of Texas, as well as a JD. She came to Washington, D.C. first as an associate at the law firm of Cohen, Milstein, Sellers, and Toll, and then joined us in the federal government as a senior advisor in the Department of Homeland Security Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. After starting her own private practice and teaching adjunct at the Georgetown Law Center, she returned to Texas as a professor of law at Texas Wesleyan. Sahar, welcome. Next, we have Dwight Holton, our senior litigation counsel at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Oregon. Dwight just finished his tour of duty as a U.S. attorney. He's been with the department for 13 years, where he brings a phenomenal breadth of experience prosecuting cases ranging from murder, environmental claims, fraud, racketeering, and terrorism. And Dwight, I'm pretty sure that covers everything we do in the department. Yeah. After graduating from Brown University and the University of Virginia, fine school I might add, law school, he joined the department after clerking for the Honorable John Gleeson of the Eastern District of New York. He served after 9/11 in our command center to protect Americans against further attack before going out to Oregon. He rose to become U.S. Attorney, where he managed 3 offices. There's only 1 district in Oregon, so it covered the entire state, which is a tremendous feat, and we're very lucky to have him today. Thank you, Dwight, for joining us. Next, we have Imam Muhammad Majid of the Islamic Society of North America. He's also the executive director and imam, or spiritual leader, of the All Dulles Area Muslim Society, also known as the Adams Center for short. He, in that capacity, has grown the center to become one of the largest mosques in the United States, serving over 5,000 families in Northern Virginia. He's also been a leader in the interfaith community. He serves on the ministry of George Mason University as a chaplain, and has been or sits on the board of the Muflihun Center, which is a think tank dedicated to research-based preventative measures for violent extremism. Imam Majid has been a recognized interfaith leader, speaking at, among other notable national occasions, as the funeral of former President Ronald Reagan, and has been a leader in advocating for Muslims within intergovernmental agencies as well. Thank you, Imam, for joining us today. And finally, we have Rabbi David Saperstein of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. The rabbi, although he was trained as an attorney, made the wise decision to not practice law and instead go into the family business of spiritual leadership in the Jewish faith. The rabbi has been the director for 35 years and has been called the quintessential Washington religious lobbyist.
Interview with my mother.
Rabbi Saperstein is the head of the Interfaith Council on Preservation of Religious Liberty. He's published a number of books, including most recently, forgive me, Rabbi, I believe it's Choices of Our Time, Moral Choices of Our Time, right. Which I look forward to reading in electronic form, by the way, if you have it. And has also, one could say, been graced with the closest thing we could have to American royalty in appearing on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Wow. So with that, I will turn to Professor Aziz to start us off.
Thank you so much, Mazen, for inviting me, and to the Civil Rights Division at Justice for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see a lot of old friends in the audience. I do miss DC. So I was tasked, first I have a very short amount of time, so I'm not going to go through everything that I could. I'll save that for the question and answer period. But I wanted to focus on the future, which was what Mazen asked me to talk about, and what we need to do based on what we listened to in the first panel. So I want to talk more about conceptually how to think about things, and then maybe specifically some recommendations. So first, I think if we're going to be dealing with civil rights violations against Muslims, there has to be a connection, or we have to acknowledge the relationship between civil liberties violations by the government and civil rights violations by the public. Because if we treat them as two tracks, we're not going to be very effective in countering particularly civil rights violations by the public. So what I would suggest is, for one, I would encourage my Civil Rights Division colleagues at Justice to focus not just on employment discrimination and anti-mosque construction and bullying against Muslim students, which is extremely important, but to also look at it from the perspective that there is a relationship between those problems and the mass surveillance of mosques, and the mass surveillance of Muslim student associations and Muslim-owned bookstores by the NYPD, for example, which is now purportedly working or supposedly working with CIA agents or former agents. And all of this has come out recently in Harper's Magazine, in the Associated Press articles, and in, I believe it was Mother Jones. So there's been a lot of articles that have come out recently that have really rattled the community. And if you ask most people, particularly in New York and other major cities where there's a major concentration of Muslims, what's on your mind, that's on their mind right now. And so I guess my recommendation is that the Civil Rights Division use its authority, particularly under Title VI, to investigate the New York Police Department. And I realize that is a very politically sensitive issue, but if we're going to be serious about the real grievances and what's going on in the community right now, we've got to take the tough issues, which is to keep our police departments in check. Now, and I say that in praise of the Civil Rights Division for its work with the Puerto Rican Police Department. They investigated the Puerto Rican Police Department for 3 years. They have a very comprehensive and very impressive report on their website that I would encourage you to look at. And they are now, I'm not sure if it's in the prosecution phase, but they certainly are taking it very seriously and making sure that people's rights aren't violated. And so I would just encourage that we have the same approach towards the LAPD, the New York Police Department, probably Chicago, and some of the other, maybe Houston. The reason why I don't think it's just NYPD is because NYPD is an exemplar at the police department level. They're the ones who came up with the homegrown terrorism report that essentially said that orthodox religious practices are indicators of terrorism, which is ridiculous. Yes, it's out there. You should read it. It was issued in 2007, and it has become a staple in trainings in police departments worldwide, nationwide. So I'm bringing this up knowing full well that it's a difficult ask, it's a controversial one, but we've got to be genuine about what we're trying to do here, and we've got to be addressing the real issues of the community. Okay, the other interrelated issue is the DOJ's guidelines on the use of race. And this is really a housekeeping issue that has been on the agenda, the civil rights agenda, for 10 years. It is, for those of you who are not familiar with the guidelines, it essentially prohibits the use of race only if it is the sole factor. It doesn't include national origin, it doesn't include religion, and it doesn't include race plus, which is usually race plus travel, so you can use other factors that are proxies for race. And it also has a huge loophole for national security context, which is essentially the context where Muslims are being most heavily impacted by law enforcement practices. So I think it would be well advised for us to try to clean that up and make sure that the policies reflect what our values, to put it succinctly. Third is, I am very concerned, and I think a lot of those who do criminal justice work are very concerned with our punitive approach to crime. And it has been used extensively in the war on drugs, and the most heavily and disparately impacted have been African Americans historically. It has now been taken and cut and pasted into the counterterrorism context. And it's played out, for example, with the Somali American community, where you have many of them feeling that, again, their mosques are being infiltrated, their community centers are infiltrated with either informants or undercover agents, and they're harassed with voluntary interviews without the rights to counsel, rather than having our government focus on getting them some community after-school activities, rehabilitating any of the lost youth or those who are having some social or mental health problems, to get them into programs that will rehabilitate them and make sure that they do not become susceptible to violent extremists on the internet that are there. They exist. I acknowledge that there are people on the internet essentially trying to bait vulnerable young Muslim men, oftentimes who are going through hard times in their personal life, such as divorce with the family, who are dealing with economic problems, and who may have just mental health problems. And so rather than saying, let's just spy on them, surveil them, prosecute them, and put them in jail, a la the mass incarceration approach, which we've been doing for the past 30 years with African Americans, why don't we learn from past mistakes and say, let's come up with something more effective and something more preventative? And I look forward to hearing Imam Majid's program, because that sounds like exactly what we need to be doing. And that leads me to the community outreach issue, which I was actively involved in the government. I think community outreach is a very good idea facially, and I think I don't have a problem with it as a matter of principle. But my experience has been that it is structurally flawed for various reasons. The current structure creates a false impression of progress in relations between the government and the community. For example, the selection of who gets to be the community representative is often not based on what I think are objective criteria. It is not based on, do you have a demonstrated constituency and you represent a voice, as opposed to you're there to self-promote yourself, or you're there to say what the government wants to hear and essentially misrepresent the community's grievances, or you're afraid to upset the government official when the community is upset about something. I mean, what's the whole point of putting all this money into this? Because it's your taxpayer dollars going to community outreach. We want something that's effective. And that there's no conflict of interest, because unfortunately some of the people who go to these community outreach meetings from the community side are doing business with the government. And you know, they'll want a deal to do some trainings or to do something on the side. We've got to make sure there's a structure in place that does not allow that to hinder the process. And then also gender issues, which is always something that people don't want to talk about. But the reality is there are not enough women leaders in these outreach meetings. Because unfortunately, some of the communities, not all of them, there is a change going on right now, an organic change, that it is still male-dominated, especially the legacy groups. The new generation of Muslim Americans is starting to change that, and a lot of the women are starting to rightfully ask for their place at the table. But that hasn't yet trickled into the community outreach model. And what the effect of that is not just a politically correct statement that, oh, let's tokenize women and have a couple of women there so we have an appearance of diversity. No, these women have perspectives, particularly if they're mothers. So I want to be there at the table to tell the community outreach person, I don't want you baiting my son. I don't want my son to be stuck between the FBI and the local police department or some violent extremist on the internet. I have a problem and I want to solve it. And that's they have certain perspectives that they want to bring to the table that will not be reflected without their voices present. And then finally, I just want to mention something that is a bit obvious but really important, is that we can't conduct ourselves domestically without, we have to put ourselves into context. We can't talk about these issues in a vacuum. If we are going to go abroad and we're going to engage in outreach abroad, and we're going to go and declare that we're the beacon of freedom and democracy, we can't treat minorities in America, particularly Muslims, since we're going and doing outreach to the Muslim world, disparately and in an indiscriminatory manner, because it reflects poorly on us and it undermines our credibility abroad. And this is particularly important in light of the Arab Spring. So what you had, which I think was great for combating anti-Muslim bias in the public, is you had millions of Muslims on television fighting for freedom, getting shot at, maimed, killed, so that they can overthrow tyrants and dictators, that some of whom were propped up by our taxpayer dollars, and there's facts to show that. And so it showed to the public, look, Muslims are not all terrorists, they're actually seeking freedom just like we are. And the problem is when we go talk to them, and I do a lot of international development work now in Egypt, is the first thing I tell them when I say, I want to help you to have a society that protects civil rights, that protects Christian rights and women's rights and people who, that are socioeconomically underprivileged. They'll say, that's fantastic, that's what we want too. But aren't you treated really poorly back in the United States? We keep reading all these things about these mosques, anti-mosque campaigns, and we keep seeing this anti-Sharia campaign, and we keep seeing all these things, and what standing do you have what leg do you have to stand on? So it's there, and if you ask people who do international development, they'll tell you. So we also, this is, we're not operating in a bubble, we're in a globalized economy and in a globalized world. So in closing, and I know I've gone over time, Mazen, I just want to say I want to highlight President Obama's wonderful speech, and it was very inspiring, in this past Sunday at the unveiling of the Dr. Martin Luther King Memorial. And he stated, quote, "Change has never been simple or without controversy. Change depends on persistence. Change requires determination. We can't be discouraged by what is. We've got to keep pushing for what ought to be, the America we ought to leave to our children. And those with power and privilege will often decry any call for change as divisive. They'll say any challenge to the existing arrangements are unwise and destabilizing. And Dr. King understood that peace without justice was no peace at all, that aligning our reality with our ideals often requires the speaking of uncomfortable truths and the creative tension of nonviolent protest. So I do thank President Obama for this lofty rhetoric, but I would add that these words apply as much to Muslim children as they do to any other American child. And we, as American Muslims, are going to be persistent and determined in demanding that we be treated with respect and equality, and that our children be free from harassment and from self-doubt on account of their faith. We will hold our heads up high and with pride, because we do give our fair share every day in preserving the character of this nation as a place for equal opportunity for all. Thank you very much.
We want the mic. Oh, yes. Good afternoon it is now, I guess. Just about exactly 50 years ago, Robert Kennedy, who was then the United States Attorney General, went to the University of Georgia in 1961 and gave a talk at the Georgia Law Day speech. And he took civil rights head on. And here's what he said. When it comes to civil rights, he said, quote, "We will not stand by or be aloof, we will move." That has been the credo, the motto, the following, our inspiration in Attorney General Holder's Department of Justice, and with Tom Perez at the head of the Civil Rights Division. It has been something that's not just been a motto, it's been a reality for every single one of us. And I'll tell you something interesting about that. That quote is so ingrained in the United States attorneys, of which there are 94 or 95, I lose track, but the United States attorneys around the nation, that I was at I was with the Attorney General and a handful of U.S. attorneys. Holder wasn't with us at this thing, but we were having a beer after an event in South Dakota where we'd been out meeting with tribal communities, and we got into an argument over the exact date that Kennedy had made that remark. And I was wrong. Melinda Haig, my colleague from San Francisco, was right. It was May. I thought it was January, right after he'd been inaugurated. That has been our guiding light and our guiding principle. I'm going to talk a little bit about our efforts and what that means on the ground, but let me address something that's come up a little bit, and there have been some questions about that I think that we haven't had a chance to handle, and that's questions about training materials. We have this kind of drip drab of learning about these egregiously false trainings which have happened at the FBI, at one of my colleagues' offices in Pennsylvania. I want to be perfectly clear about this. Training materials that portray Islam as a religion of violence or with a tendency towards violence are wrong, they are offensive, and they are contrary to everything that this president, this Attorney General, and the Department of Justice stands for. They will not be tolerated. The false narratives these false trainings pose a significant threat to national security, because they play into a false narrative propagated by terrorists that the United States is at war with Islam. That is false, and we will not tolerate it. I've spoken with the Attorney General about this directly when he was out in Oregon not long ago. He is firmly committed to making sure that this is over. Now, the reality is that it's going to take a while for us to figure out what trainings have happened in the past that we need to go back and fix. We're a big organization and we got lots going on with lots of people and lots of contractors, but Attorney General Holder is firmly committed to it and we're going to fix it. And we're going to make sure that people understand the incredibly deleterious effects of these trainings. I'll say one more thing about it before I get to my remarks, and I'm sorry I'm stealing some time here, but I think it's important. I was talking to my FBI SAC, the special agent in charge, the day after the latest revelation, well, not the latest revelation, the Quantico revelations came out about the training in Quantico, and the SAC said to me, Greg Fowler, he used to be in New York, he's now in Oregon, he said, you know, they tell you on your first day as an agent at the FBI that one person can make a difference. What they forget to tell you is you can be a good difference or a bad difference. So we're working hard to get that right, and it's really exceedingly important, and we get it. For national security reasons, for civil rights reasons, and for justice reasons. I just finished a tour as the United States Attorney for Oregon. Many folks will remember my tour as the time when we arrested a Somali young man after he had aspirations and attempted to blow up the Pioneer Square tree lighting ceremony in downtown Portland. But the real legacy of my tenure, I hope, will be what's happened since then. Our efforts to engage with the Muslim community, and really these are efforts that started before that night. I've been an assistant United States attorney. I've been a federal prosecutor for 15 years. I've worked on terrorism cases. I've worked on complex environmental crimes cases. I was, as Mazen mentioned, I lived in New York. I was working in the Eastern District of New York on September 11th. I was in the command post for weeks after that. I lived in Battery Park City, about 100 yards from the World Trade Center. The efforts to engage with the Muslim community are the most important thing I've done in my 15-year career with the Department of Justice. And they've also, frankly, been the most fun, and I have the 10 pounds in lamb weight I've put on in the past 8 months to prove it. The DAG, the Deputy Attorney General, mentioned our efforts, the U.S. Attorney's efforts briefly this morning, I know, but let me tell you a little bit more about them and give you some specifics. They're really, there's no math to this, so I don't want to make it sound like there is, but I kind of identify 4 prongs of what we in the United States attorney community have been up to. Before I tell you those prongs, I want to say one thing. I think that people often I've often heard people misdescribe our engagement efforts as a need to go off and explain something or a need to tell people something. That's completely backwards. The United States Attorney's role in our engagement is to listen and to learn how we can do our job better and to equip and empower people in the community to help us do our job on the civil rights side and on the national security side. And I'll tell you more about it. The 4 prongs that I was kind of playing out this morning when I was thinking about what to say here today are, number 1, making sure we do our jobs better in law enforcement. Number 2, sorry, I'm checking my terrible handwriting notes. Number 2, equipping and empowering leaders in the community to help us do our jobs better. Number 3, public leadership efforts like anti-bullying efforts, which I'll talk about more in a second. And number 4, our civil rights efforts. Not in any particular order, but those are the 4 things I think that are very significant parts of our engagement efforts. So last summer the Attorney General charged U.S. attorneys to play a leading role in civic engagement with Muslim communities. And again, the first prong of that, I think, has been making sure we do our jobs better. So before this effort, I think, a lot of us didn't quite understand that whenever we make a high-profile arrest in a terrorism case that involves someone who thinks they follow Islam, it creates a mini backlash. against people in the community. So people in my community, after we arrested Muhammad, people who were outwardly, had outward trappings of being Muslim, you know, they waited longer in restaurants. They got hassled at the cash register. They got flipped off on the highway, even in tolerant Portland and tolerant Oregon. And of course, there was an attack against the mosque in Corvallis. Understanding that, we've tried to do better. So for example, in the 37-page complaint that laid out the allegations against Muhammad, he is never once identified as a Muslim. We were very careful about that. It's not relevant from our perspective. What's relevant is his violence, not the religion he considers he follows. Secondly, the way we talked about the case. Every time I opened my mouth about that case, I said I had 2 or 3 kind of main points, and one of them is violent extremism knows no country, no religion, no boundaries. Of all the hateful things that have been said about me as U.S. Attorney, it's fine, right? It's part of the job. It's no big deal. Bloggers comment. And believe me, the medical marijuana crowd does not love me. But of all the hateful things, the most hateful thing that has been said about me was in response to me saying that, right? So there are people who don't get it, of course, but the point is that's an incredibly important part of what we do. The day after the tree lighting, I was out in Pioneer Square saying exactly that. So number one, we need to do our jobs better. Number two, the real fun and I think effective part of this has been our efforts to equip and empower folks in the community. And for me, that has been building trust through hospitality. You know, this is the way I was raised. If you want to get to know somebody, if you want to build trust with somebody, you invite them over to dinner. So I began with a dinner that was supposed to be for Tom in January, but y'all had this big snowstorm, so Tom didn't make it. We had the dinner anyway. I had 15 or 20 imams in my house whom I'd never met before, many of whom were grumpy at us, many of whom never talked to each other and were grumpy at each other for different reasons. Squozing into my 1,500 square foot house in Portland, and I cooked a huge halal meal, and there was a change moment sitting around that table, because I had us sitting around this table, when the Bosnian imam in town asked me, it's kind of quiet because no one, you know, we don't know what we're doing here yet. The Bosnian imam asked me, so what's our agenda for tonight? And I said, we don't have an agenda. And you could just feel the tension drain on. I wasn't here to explain anything. I wasn't here to lecture them. I wasn't here to ask for anything. I wanted to get to know these people. The last imam left about 2 in the morning, Shahir Ahmed, very good friend. And you know, my wife now jokes that our social life has been taken over by Muslim engagement, because you know, you invite 15 people over to your house, you're going to 15 people's houses in this community. After that, and we only half. This actually isn't it. This is factually true. No one here is allowed to tell my mother-in-law that their children, her grandchildren, have spent much more time in mosques lately than they have in the Catholic Church. So this became a series of dinners, and you know, we had Tom did make it out in June. We had Quentin Wiktorowicz from the White House out in September. The most recent event was Attorney General Holder, who came out to Oregon. He was in Oregon for 4 hours, basically to see the office. He had time for one public event. I gave him a whole list of things we could do, anti-bullying thing for LGBT stuff, or prescription drugs are killing us. I wanted to do a prescription drug event. One of the things on the list was a potluck with Muslim community leaders, and Holder said, that's what I want to do. So we had a potluck in the U.S. Attorney's office. We got, you know, nice, I brought in some nice textiles and dressed up my conference room, and everybody brought food, and we broke bread with the Attorney General. Now we're moving into tangible stuff. When Quentin was out, one of my community new friends raised her hand and said, okay, what do you want us to do? And I kind of had been used to trying to build relationships, kind of had a general answer. She's like, no. What do you want us to do? We're ready to form a committee to start doing whatever it is you want on this so we can do our role. And we're doing 2 things. One addresses the training head-on, although we started this before there was any recent news on this stuff. We're going to do, my little group is developing a curriculum for an Islam 101 session for law enforcement in Oregon. We're going to hold it in the federal courthouse. They're going to lead it. I'm hoping to get Bill Braniff out, who's this great guy from West Point, who was supposed to give the training that day at Quantico, but got slotted out for some reason. What a disaster. So we're going to have an Islam 101 session that's going to be great. It's going to help spread it. We're talked to the World Affairs Council in Oregon, which is a great speakers bureau, about helping curriculum with religious tolerance curriculum in public schools. Doing Islam 1.0 session with the broader community in Portland, you kind of get the choir there, right? You want to sing to the choir, you want to sing beyond it, so we're looking at public schools. And the other thing we're doing is engaging the Next Generation Summit. This is the second real big project for this group, where Sahar mentioned sports leagues and things like that to engage people in the Somali community. That's exactly what we're going to do. We're bringing together to the courthouse interfaith groups, nonprofits, Mercy Corps, Nike, Adidas. I'm working on this still, so don't expect it to happen anytime soon. But this is the plan, and I've been thinking about this literally since January, building these relationships, and then I've got Samir Golden from Southwest Portland saying, what can we do? Okay, we'll do that. And so, my friend Mustafa Arafin's now the project manager on this. Most of these folks work at places like Intel. They call, that project manager is how they do things. They're off to the races, and it's terrific, and it's terrifically important. 3, on the bullying point, I'm way over time, I think, so I'll sit down soon. But someone raised this earlier, I think it was Armady. I'm in schools a lot talking about bullying. A lot of it has to do with LGBT stuff, but a lot of it has to do with Islam as well, with Muslim Americans as well. There's a young American kid whose family's from Bangladesh who told me at an event out at Intel that he does not go a day, he's a high school kid, without a bomb joke. Where's your bomb today? Come on. This is the kind of stuff that pushes people away from the American project. Not this kid, he's gonna be okay. But the whole point of our summit is to figure out what pushes people away from the American project: Islamophobia, racism, dislocation, economic dislocation, cultural dislocation, radicalizers, not just online, I would say, Sahar, but also in person. And then talk about what we can do to bring them back. And it's mentoring. I need doctors there so doctors can do mentoring programs. I need Adidas and Nike there so they can do sports stuff. I need the other more traditional engagement crowd. So we're working very hard on that, and it's a very significant problem. Tom Perez, I'm going to steal one of Tom's lines. Tom likes to say that today's bully is tomorrow's civil rights defendant. We want to stop them at the bullying stage, at the preventing the bullying stage. Fourth and finally, our civil rights efforts have to be aggressive and effective. I thought after a very harried couple of weeks that involved a bunch of things, including an environmental crime summit I ran here for the AG, and then the tree lighting thing, I thought I was done. And I wake up on Sunday morning with an 8 a.m. call after the Friday night arrest from the SAC saying that somebody had attacked the mosque in Corvallis, and we needed to go there. So Art and I, the SAC and I, went to Corvallis, and we ended up there. I dreaded this, the whole trip down there. It's an hour and a half, and I thought, these poor people have been attacked. It's going to be awful. It was one of the best days of my career. I spent 12 hours with people in that community, and the fact that we were there was an important step. More important step, in August, we indicted the guy who did it. We did it, by the way, I will say, by the kind of going out into the neighborhood and literally knocking on doors tactics. An agent knocked on this guy's door, something was hinky, and that's New York speak for suspicious. And we've gradually built the case out of it. We've got to get that part of it right, and we're trying very hard to get it right. People have mentioned their 9/11 memories. I'll stop in 1 second. Sorry. Mine is very short, but my memory is from 9/11, 2011. I was in New York, or I was actually in DC, but living in New York on September 11, 2001. And fast forward 10 years, I spent September 11th in a mosque in Beaverton, the Bilal Mosque, with my friend Shair Ahmed. And I said to that congregation, and it's true, when out west, they don't really get September 11th like we do, like those of us who are here on the East Coast. This is something they watched on TV, if at all. The people in the Portland metro area who understand and who I could identify with most on September 11th were the people who either lived here and the Muslim community, because they're the ones who felt it in Oregon that day. And so I told them that because I was really happy to be there. And I'm sorry I talked too long.
Good morning. Peace be upon you. I borrowed the rabbi watch to make sure that I'm on time. And he wanted me to on time. I would like just to thank the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division for really bringing us all of us together this morning And I think this is itself as a good sign for all of us to be here to speak about very important issue about the discrimination and the civil rights issues after 9/11. I would like to begin my talk by saying that so many things I want to say about what have happened to us as Muslim community after 9/11 have been mentioned in the previous panel. I don't like to repeat all of that, but life have changed. I was hired to be an imam that preside over marriages and help people at a difficult time in funeral prayer and visiting the sick. And I find myself to be the imam that have to speak to media and to attend all government meetings and to be a person addressing the issue of violence extremism that I take very strong stand that have seen in recent years that have increased, unfortunately. Now, what can we do? What can we go from here? First, I would like to say that the number of discriminations and violations of the rights of Muslims have not, the numbers of cases have not been reported accurately because some of those cases have not been reported by Muslims. For number one, I would like to invite this Civil Rights Division to have more town hall meetings in Muslim communities, in mosques, to encourage Muslims community to report cases and to know that the door is wide open for them to report the cases of discriminations. This is number one. Number two, I would like to have the government to review all the policies and some of the behavior of the government that was not correct and continue some of them not to be correct since 9/11 until today, and to see what we have done about those issues. Because people who spoke about the training, Muslim community, they want a tangible change to be really seen by them, not to say that we're just working on it, but to say, we were here and now we are here. We made sure those kind of people will not come back to training. The materials have changed. The guidelines that have been given to law enforcement have changed. Those are the tangible things Muslims would like to see happening. Number three, that we need more people to speak against the propaganda and Islamophobia that we see today on radio. 3 hours, a radio talk show will speak negative about Islam and Muslims. Do you think this goes to deaf ears? There's millions of people listening to this. Some of them are the police officers, customs officers, immigration officers, teachers in the school. Words really can have great impact on people's perception about others. Therefore, we need more people to speak in this issue. And I would like to address the issue of the religious bigotry and hate. As an imam, I understand that the importance of me as an imam not to allow anyone in the mosque, Adam Center, to preach hatred or bigotry in the mosque. But I would like also to hold my fellow clergy to the same standards, with the pastors and rabbis as the same. And I would like just to say here that I'm very proud of the religious community who come together with us and created an organization called Shoulder to Shoulder. 26 religious group, very influential groups. And Rabbi David is one of them, who spoke in a very united voice against bigotry and hate after the issue of the Park 51 mosque and the burning of the Holy Quran. And they said in one voice, attack in one religion is an attack on all religions. That day, I left home with a lot of hope. When I looked and the people were standing next to me, rabbi and ministers and pastors of great churches and communities. We need more of that. We need more people to speak to their congregations about tolerance and understanding and respecting one another. When you hear an imam say something not wise, it's all over the news, isn't it? But do we hear about people, other clergy, who might say something to their congregation is not wise? I would like us to see this dialogue about civil rights, civil liberties of Muslims take place in a different form, whether in the mosque, synagogues, community centers. I have visited Europe, and I have seen what happened during the Holocaust. And I can tell you, hate leads to people being burned. You have seen what happened in Norway. There's 12 books, bestsellers in America. All of them have poison materials against Muslims, preaching nothing but hate. We have to really single out those people and to say, you are really dividing this beautiful country. Because this kind of teaching, it makes the teacher in the school make a fun of our children. The bullying in the schools is a result of this preaching of hate. But also, this country gave me a lot of hope that I just come to know that the person who was not allowed to go to Hajj had won her case in the Supreme Court. And Rahima is here. The lady who defended her is in this audience. This country is a country of law as well. And finally, so I would like to break the record that the Imam spoke the shortest. We need to learn from the experience. What have worked, what have not worked. And this is my suggestions. My suggestion to look to 3 models where things have worked well with government and the community, with law enforcement and the community, and 3 models that where things have not worked well. What can we learn from the bad, policies? Because it has to be, moving forward, has to be a learning moment. And I would like to thank the Department of Justice for convening this interagency meeting. Very beneficial for people to be able to speak to more than one department in one meeting, sharing information and conveying our concerns. I would like to thank you again for this opportunity and look forward for the discussions. I'm going to leave the workshop.
I do want to thank the Justice Department and GW Law School here. It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel. This morning we heard from a panel who is rightfully feted for the wonderful contributions that they made in those days after and years after 9/11. Eric was appropriately feted. I want to just mention 2 other people. One has just been talked about, Tom Perez. The extraordinary vibrancy and robustness of the civil rights agenda of this administration is represented by that office, and particularly his openness on religious concerns really has been heartening to all of us, and we're deeply, deeply appreciative, Tom. And there's one other person who I just have to tell you just dazzles me. With the 3 of us, between Shahara and Dwight and myself, you have 3 of the fastest speakers that I have ever heard. And watching this extraordinary signer down here keep up with us, that was really something impressive here. 9/11 reminds us, as if we ever needed reminding, that religious adherence and passions are no guarantee of moral behavior. Every religious tradition can be used to justify war and peace. intolerance and empathy, bigotry and understanding, cruelty and compassion. It is precisely the role of the religious community to help decide which of those choices are going to be made. It's in that context that I come to speak with you today. I want to talk, as we move into the future on this, about 5 responsibilities that I think the religious community particularly has. One is always to put a human face on what this is about. We hear numbers, we see statistics, we read polling data here, we hear how many cases are being brought here and what's being done there. But as every person who's involved in these, who has to litigate, who has to adjudicate knows, every one of those is a human story. And the more people see this in human terms, the more open they are to understanding the fundamental messages there. And that helps us also in terms of responding to the bullying. A lot of those kids who are in our secular school systems, who are involved, they're also in our religious schools. It is a great place to begin in terms of teaching the kind of respect for diversity and pluralism that is America's glory. And we need to play a key role in fighting that issue. Secondly, any faith group that gets defined by the words or the actions of its most extreme elements, by a small group of phrases that are extreme phrases from our sacred texts, by the worst of our moments in our history, is going to be delegitimized and its members are going to be endangered. There is a conscientious effort to do that to Islam. I was very heartened by Dwight's powerful words on that. It has to be matched by what the rest of the religious communities do. It isn't, if it is Muslims are left to defend themselves on this issue, they are in an impossible situation. Religious communities have to stand shoulder to shoulder, as the Imam said, in the extraordinary work that ISNA has done in putting together these interfaith coalitions. That kind of interfaith response always is indispensable. I always tell our rabbis, if there's a desecration of a synagogue or something, first call after to law enforcement, it has to be to your Christian, Muslim, and other religious leaders, because this can't be a Jewish against them issue. It has to be the good people in the community against those who are the bigots and the extremists here. And time and again, watching non-Muslims stand around mosques that have been desecrated and stand physically in their presence and help to clean up the damage that has been done has been heartening to us. That is an indispensable role of the interfaith community, and we have to continue it as time goes on. Third, the mosque debates, the Quran burning debates that go on, that kind of bigotry also requires us to play a key role. It is the things that grab the media's attention that we have to be smart about how to position ourselves to create a different face for this. And I don't mean only in terms of America's interests across the globe, that they see the reality of what's represented in those polls. You know, it's always the people who are dissatisfied who get the attention, and not the people who are satisfied. It is always the people who you know, man bites dog, dog bites man. It's always the, you know, the plane crashes, the plane lands here. It's always the extreme, unusual things that get the attention. We have to find a way to put another face on it. We have to play a key role. I'm proud again of the interreligious community's role in the Quran burnings here. To burn someone's sacred text is so violative of the core principles of America in terms of freedom of expression, everything enshrined in our First Amendment, and the core principles of all of our religious traditions here. We need to play a visible and effective role on these issues. Fourth, related to that is the issue of Sharia laws. Here, this fantasy that somehow Sharia by stealth is taking over America, the 12 states that have considered laws, the 3 that have passed laws here. If they did that about Jewish law or about Catholic law, canon law, the country would be outraged about this. And it is time for us to really stand up and try to address that more forcefully than we have done. Here, wherever in response to profiling, in response to infringements on civil liberties, wherever that happens, we have to deal in part not just in the public debates, but on the legal issues as well and what the laws are. So if we're really going to stop discrimination, Stuart, it's not only the robustness of what you do, and thank you for what you do in terms of job bias on this issue. We've got to pass a Workplace Religious Freedom Act here to restore more vigorous legal grounding to the work that you are doing. And the robustness, Tom, of the work that you've done in terms of RLUIPA and RFRA, where it applies here, has been so encouraging to us all. But we have to make that a norm in states and state laws across the country as well here. We have to tackle the tough issue of how to get right the Title VI religion issues, complex issues, but to be sure that religion is a protected class from the kind of bias that Title VI protects. And we have to ensure, as many of the religious communities were out front early on in the Patriot Act debates and other pieces of this, to ensure that civil liberties would be protected, argued for some changes that would protect civil liberties. That can't just be an abstract legal battle. It has to be a citizens' battle in America. And again, the religious communities play an important role on this issue. And finally, it is in the interreligious cooperation that's been so heartening in the wake of 9/11. There's so much that's happened across the globe and here in the United States in terms of strengthening interreligious dialogue, interreligious coalition. You want to change people's attitudes? Dialogue is important, learning about each other. You want to stop some of the frightening impressions you have? Then sit down with people in common religious concern and respect for each other and learn about each other's religious traditions. But talking about it is never enough. It is always the doing that is essential here. And when people come into each other's homes and share social encounters together, when people work in churches and synagogues and youth groups and religious schools on common community projects, in feeding the hungry and taking care of the homeless and helping clean up the environment, in helping to tutor kids who need tutoring, in working together, we build bridges of understanding and trust that surpass anything that we can do just talking about it theoretically. And no institutions play a more important role in making that happen than the religious institutions of America do. So these are vital challenges for us and ones in which we can play a key role. It requires the legal structures of America to do it. It requires the civil society structures led by the religious structures of America to do this. We're at a crossroads in this country. We can model for the world about how to get this right. America, as those polls indicated in Pew's polling and Gallup's polling across the globe, America's done a much better job in absorbing immigrants and refugees from other countries, including Muslim countries, and making them feel part of the American commonweal. But we have to get this right, not just for America's sake, but the world needs it now. And we stand together, the religious communities, to be that bastion of hope and that recognition that we really can do, we must do, we will do better in the future. And together, in the Jewish tradition, there's a line in the Talmud that says, you and I together, we can change the world. Here, I would say to the legal communities and the religious communities that are brought together here today, together we truly can change, not just America, but the world. Thank you.
Is this working? Hello? Yes. First, I'd like to let the audience know that they can ask questions by writing them down on their on the note cards and passing them up to Eric Treen. Eric, if you just raise your hand for folks. And he, through the magic of Bluetooth, will beam them up to me. Sahar, one of the issues that you raised was, or that you touched on, and I'd like to hear more about it, was the sort of cross-sectional issues of gender and religion that I know concern you. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, actually, it's timely that you mentioned this because I just finished writing an extensive article that's going to be published in the Hastings Poverty and Law Review about essentially the intersection of race, religion, and gender and how that's affecting American Muslim women. And what I found through research is that American Muslim women have been, it's comparable to during the Civil Rights Movement. Black women's unique issues were not addressed by straight anti-racism civil rights and straight gender rights issues, groups, and that her specific experience was not adequately addressed, and particularly the grievances and challenges that she was experiencing. And what I found by applying the theory of intersectionality, which those of you who have heard of Kimberly Crenshaw, she came up with this in the 90s, was that American Muslim women were not any different. And so from the kind of facial lack of representation within the various forums, from the community outreach to the community leadership positions, et cetera, but also the unique ways in which she experiences discrimination, where when you wear a headscarf, you are marked as a Muslim. People know you are a Muslim. There's no passing. And that many women then were forced to take off their headscarf out of fear, and which then implicates their individual expressive rights. And because it's not just about religion. It is about religion, but it's also about your individual rights, which I think is also a woman's issue, to be able to have autonomy over how she dresses and over what her definition of modesty is, and not have people coerce her either way, whether it's by the stereotypical patriarchal model or by the Western liberal model that, or by the post 9/11 terrorism model. So part of it is also a women's rights issue, and also, and in my paper, if I hope you all will read it, it talks about the, in my opinion, complete lack of the failure of women's rights groups to address these issues. And it's been very, very disappointing. Women's rights groups, American women's rights groups, have spent all their time trying to save Muslim women abroad in what I call a very flawed, patronizing model, because I know I have a lot of family members who are Muslim and Arab and live abroad, and they're nothing meek. Meek does not even, you can't even use the characteristic weak to describe them. It's only strength. And so they're spending their time trying to save Muslim women, but nobody's paying attention to what's happening here and contextualizing it within gender rights issues. And it's also, so that's that context, and then also just within the Muslim civil rights context.
I've always found it productive when we see a discussion between our panelists. So, Imam, would you like to respond to what Sahar was just saying?
Yeah. You would like me to start a controversial thing? But I agree with Sahar, actually. I have 5 daughters, and therefore this issue of gender is very important to me. I do believe that the religious group in America have the moral obligation to stand with Muslim women. And I would like to give an example for the Jewish women in our community. After 9/11, when they heard that maybe some Muslim women hesitant to go shopping because of the headscarf, a group of Jewish women get together and decided to wear scarves and to go shopping with Muslim community women. And they had started the dialogue, they meet every month and so forth. And I do believe the moral obligations in the religious community to stand with the fellow Americans, especially Muslim women, it is one of the key creating that comfort to American Muslim women. But I would like to say that I'm very proud of the work of American Muslim women, and have strong Muslim American women sitting in this audience who have been teaching and sharing Islam with others. And I do believe that to see more of them in the front line, it will strengthen the Muslim community. I'm all for it, Sahar, what you said, And I'm very proud to say that Ingrid Mattson was the president of this organization. She mentored me, I took after her, I learned from her, and she's the person that I rely on her advice and her wisdom.
Joy, one of the issues that occurred to me in part of your comments are so much of your success, I think, in Oregon is, in no small part to what could easily be described as your winning personality. How can we ensure, as effective outreach, engagement, and productive relations between our department and government generally without having to rely so heavily on sort of individual characteristics?
So, I think, thank you, but I'm not sure that's right. And I will say that I was at a conference actually with Imam Majd and some others in the spring on countering violent extremism, and someone had recognized me in the audience and said, "That's the guy who had the dinner," and people applauded. And I got up and said, "Didn't you people's mothers raise you right? I mean, this is what we do." So I'm not sure that that's necessarily I don't think it's necessarily my winning personality. Maybe it's my ability to make a good chana, but I got recipes and I'll share. I do think though that the lesson is that goes to some of the Pew data, and that the more time people spend in the community and with Muslim Americans, the less they are afeared. And so this is a matter of kind of jumping in with both feet. And so I think that on the one hand, the United States Attorney the reason we were asked to do this by the Attorney General is as of all the actors in government, and Homeland Security does a bunch of stuff as well, and we're not the only agency, FBI does stuff, is that we are uniquely local and federal officials. So I work for Main Justice and do what the DAG and the Attorney General tell me to, but I have a local constituency. And so it puts me in a situation to be in the community. And Attorney General Holder's model of what we as U.S. attorneys ought to be doing, not just on Muslim engagement, but on prescription drug abuse, on pick an issue, is being in the community. So while I'm glad I come across nicely, I really think it has to do with kind of shifting the model to seeing the U.S. attorneys or whoever you're going to have do this part of the engagement as affirmative leaders. And then it just spreads infectiously, right? So I've got people now from my Muslim partners who are incredibly warm and made it work. That's what made it work, really. But they're off doing stuff that they would never have done before, seeing people they know. When I do these dinners, I don't just invite imams. I invite the head of Mercy Corps and the head of, or a city council person or whoever, to try and get those folks connected. And again, so I think the model needs to be that we need to, it has to be built on trust, and trust comes from some of that initial contact.
I'm sorry, can I just interject, because this is, now I'd like to have a debate with you, but this isn't really about Portland. Again, I don't mean to be hitting on the, hitting the FBI, the NYPD too hard, but they kind of deserve it after what we've discovered. But for example, there's an article by ABC News, and I brought this with me. It's called "NYPD Spied on City's Muslim Partners." And this has been a real problem with this outreach stuff, is that the people are going in good faith, and the community members, they're attending, they're kind of being very honest about what their grievances are, and they're telling the government, this is what we want you to do. We want you to fix the watch list and get us off if we're not supposed to be on there, give us some due process rights. We want you not to spy on our community unless there is a nexus, a predicate act of criminal activity vis-a-vis that person, as opposed to a threat assessment, which, if those of you who know the investigative guidelines now, at least this is the FBI, can go and engage in. They can indefinitely follow you around. They can engage in pretext interviews, which essentially they hide who they are and engage in some conversation with you. And then they can also, there was a third, I'm just blanking on the third thing, but anyway, all of it is, these threat assessments allow them to essentially open an investigation on someone without a predicate act or individualized suspicion. That's highly problematic. So I guess the question that I would pose to you, Dwight, is, how, and I'm not saying this has happened in your community, because it's spotty. The NYPD's got the worst record. I think the LAPD too's got a bad record with the guy who just went public about how he was told to go into the mosques and create terrorists. This is Craig Montel, who's now suing the FBI. But there's a big disconnect. These communities are going, they're acting in good faith, and then they find out that their imams who were going to the outreach meetings were being spied on. Some of them have been deported, some of them have been prosecuted. And then none of the policies are changing, at least not fast enough, if at all. So how are you managing that? Because there's definitely a disconnect.
Because the way I manage it is to be incredibly straightforward about what we're doing all the time. So that doesn't mean I tell people our tactics or what our investigations are, but I make very clear to people that we have a job to do that is not just national security, but it's crime prevention or criminal enforcement. And so I say to people, I've said to people a lot. I said it the first night, that first dinner when I was meeting people. Look, we are going to arrest people in your community, and it's going to make you upset if you don't know why or if you don't understand why what we're up to. But you know what? When I arrest an investment banker in Lake Oswego, which is our McLean, everyone in that neighborhood is mad at me. But they have a basic trust level that they are comfortable enough with what we do that they are, while grumpy about it, they have a basic confidence in what we're doing. So what I need to do is develop the confidence in the community so that when we have to arrest somebody, their reaction is, well, I hope you're wrong about that guy. I sure thought something different about him. The threat assessment, I take issue with your well, the threat assessment is a power the FBI has to do a couple of things like conduct undercover interviews or conduct interviews without identifying yourself, subpoenas of phone records, although not broader subpoenas. It's not things like searches or anything like that. And if we hear there's a gang problem in North Portland, we would like to send, or we know there's a gang problem in North Portland, we would like to be able to send somebody into barbershops there, which are a center of the community, and talk to people and say, what are you hearing about this? We hear that there's some Hoover Crips gang tags showing up in the neighborhood. Without, the threat assessment creates that authority. The FBI couldn't do it otherwise. If you have to have individualized suspicion, you can't walk into a barbershop and say, what are you hearing about gang authority? Now, this is something that's community policing that police communities do every single day. And the FBI didn't have that authority, so the threat assessment authority was intended to do that. You have to be very careful with it, there's no doubt about it, because what you can't have is abuse of it, where you're just trolling.
Exactly.
Now, but one other point I want to make that I think is really, and that's right, and so it has to be watched carefully.
And you're talking about First Amendment protected activities too. Gang activity is
Sure.
one thing, but what the concern is people are going and being asked, so often do you pray? Do you pray the Fajr prayer? Because
Oh,
that's
well,
a
that's
sign if you're going really early. And if you've got community policing where you have the communities are trusting law enforcement, they're going to go and tell you. There's absolutely no interest in the community, one, to get itself bombed, if there's somebody
Right,
that's going to
exactly
bomb.
right.
Two, to get the backlash. So I still have some reservations
But this
about
is
the
exactly
use
what,
of threat assessment.
but this is exactly what I hear from my community members. If we have people in our community, come do whatever you got to do. If you have somebody you have to put on the no-fly list, okay, we want to be secure too. Now, there may be particular people they want to know why they're on the no-fly list. But I will say, and this is one of the things I'm also very direct about with my community. Are we targeting you for criminal enforcement? No. Are we paying more attention to your community because we are worried that you are being targeted by bad people who want to take your children and send them in to kill people? You bet. So, but I'm just very direct about that. And so there's a woman in Minneapolis who made a movie about the 20 kids who disappeared on November 8th, 2008, and ended up in Somalia fighting al-Shabaab, some of whom were killed, one of whom was killed in a terrorist attack, some of whom were killed trying to come back to the United States because they didn't like what they were doing there. And the great new Somali organization brought that woman to the filmmaker to Portland to do a showing of the movie. They had 200 people in the audience, most of them Somali. It was terrific. They understand that, just like the gang problem in North Portland, I spend a bunch more time in North Portland than my predecessor because the gang problem is on the move there.
Right, but I think that's collective punishment. I think if you're on the side of the community, I don't want to have to worry that the FBI is everywhere because one guy, one Muslim went and decided to join a terrorist group, so then our entire community now has to worry how many people are in the mosque, how many pretextual interviews are going on. Be transparent about it. Work with the community. And I'm sure Imam Magid and Rabbi Saperstein and work on these issues. I mean, community policing is not something the community is against. It's the transparency issue. And one other point, which is my big issue, is tell the community.
Can I break it up here?
Just tell the community that you can have a lawyer when you have a voluntary interview. That's all I ask, because even when we tell the FBI and when we tell the U.S. attorneys, could you please tell them that they have a right to an attorney? They get really upset about that. It's like, why is it a problem that Muslims, if they invoke their rights to have an attorney present for a voluntary interview, why is that suddenly pro-terrorist? Why is that a problem? I mean, a banker can have a lawyer.
Sure, but when we go to the barber shop to interview the barber about the gang activity, we don't say, by the way, you can have a lawyer.
You should.
Oh, come on.
All right. moving on. I'm going to combine some of these questions that I'm getting from the audience. Rabbi, you know, one of the issues that people have raised are, you know, how is the Muslim community perceived in the interfaith community? In other words, what can you know, folks either here at the department or in the interfaith community do to sort of improve relations, interfaith relations in the community, and to improve you know, true interfaith dialogue, and not simply you know, standing up when there's a need to stand up?
We've worked together, ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, and the National Reformed Jewish Movement, as have other groupings in the Jewish community and Muslim community, to set up ongoing twinning of mosques and synagogues, dialogue programs that will be ongoing presences in communities across America. And we publish at our website lists of successful programs like that that are going along. One of the problems, and as I think most people know, is the Muslim community is still new to the Christian and Jewish communities in the United States, and the structures are different. It's not denominationally structured here. The role of clergy is a little bit different than in some of the other groups. And people often in the non-Muslim community don't know, well, who do I ask for, and what's the difference between that mosque and this mosque here, and you know, who do you call? These are really, it's going to take us a while to work through modalities of helping people to understand the structure of the Muslim community and who's who and what's what, and how to reach out to folks. So there are challenges that we're all actively working on together, but we don't minimize how serious those challenges are in achieving the level of interaction and a kind of normalcy of the interaction that all of us would like to see.
Imam, would you like to respond to that at all?
I do believe that we come a long way in the issue of interfaith. Having, again, to see the organizations, religious organization, actually contribute to create an organization to defend the Muslims in America. And we have the director here somewhere of this organization. That itself is a serious step. It's not just holding hand with singing We Are the World, but we're defending one another's rights. And I do believe that when a religious community speaks to his own community about an issue that maybe an imam or a rabbi or a pastor have raised, and the issue of bigotry and hate, that really built trust between us and the fellow religious community. If I speak about the Holocaust denial, it's not like the Rabbi David is speaking about it, because if the imam speak about it, it's have more credibility, because that's expected of Rabbi David to speak about the Holocaust denial against it. As well, when he speak about the Islamophobia and the rise of Muslim building a mosque, it is go a long way than the imam talking about it. Therefore, I do believe that we moving forward. And one of the things I'd like just to mention, maybe make an advertisement for UBF here, that we have members of the community who create movies where addressing issues that people have not spoken about, and people see the movie and have a dialogue about it. That we want to people to address issues that really we may have avoided for sometimes, rather than speaking about the commonality, but we're going to speak about the differences, what are the issues that really challenge all of us as faith community.
Okay. I have a question here from the audience. I think you know, one of the advantages of doing questions in an anonymous way is people feel comfortable asking difficult questions. So I'm going to ask them. But this one is directed to Dwight. I'm going to direct it both to Dwight and Imam Majid. You know, Dwight, you discussed the training materials that the department clearly does not condone. But the question is, is the reason you dislike these training materials simply because they're offensive, or is there a legitimate, isn't there a legitimate reason to discuss possibly negative aspects of the religion of Islam?
The materials I have seen are just so patently offensive and wrong that it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, if you train someone with anti-narcotics trafficking material that was as wrong as this, it sends you chasing the wrong tree. It sends you up to go up the wrong tree. I'm mixing metaphors, but you know what I'm talking about. It distracts your real resources from where you really ought to be. And in this context, as I said, and this is what I think is, look, this bothers me because it's offensive. It bothers me because it breeds hatred. But my principal job as the United States Attorney is national security. And the gold standard of what we do is keeping people from being dead in our districts. And when you have people making giving trainings based on false information that plays directly into an al-Qaeda narrative that we're at war with Islam, which is an utterly false narrative, it threatens national security. So I find it offensive and counterproductive and dangerous for those reasons.
Imam?
And also is a violation of Muslim rights. Really teaching people that all Muslims are a threat to this country, violating the religious rights of Muslims to practice Islam in America. It is against the law, against the Constitution. It's not only offensive, but it is not acceptable. And the guidelines, the law enforcement to say, the indicators of possibility of a person be radicalized, that if he attend the mosque regularly or become politically active or become very critical of the American foreign policy, this is wrong. And the Department of Justice must look into this and make sure those indicators have been taken out of those guidelines with the FBI. It's unacceptable to having them to be there. And I would like to say that Muslims are the first line of fighting violent extremism. And we need to teach people also the norms, what Islam is. If you have people being told every day what is the bad Islam look like, or what they call it, so-called, or the misinterpretation of Islam, but you don't tell them the norms, how are they going to realize that the Muslims, average Muslim Americans, their values, the core values, like Christian, like Jews, like anyone else? That we have to teach that as well. Therefore, I'm going to be honest, I'm very upset with this training. Not only me, Muslim community is very upset about this training. And it must change, and we need real change. And we need to be told what are the changes have been made. And the people who teaching Islamophobia, teaching those law enforcement, are the people that the man in Norway have quoted and took people's life based on what he have heard. It is not just someone come and speak to a group of people. It led to violence. They have blood in their hand of innocent people in Europe. Therefore, it's a very serious issue for all of us as Muslims. Therefore, I would like to see change happen in this regard and happen fast.
I think also something to add is to just be more aggressive with your Title VI enforcement by DHS and by DOJ, which essentially forbids anyone who receives federal funding to engage in discrimination on account of race, national origin, and color. And I think a creative lawyer, I'd be willing to at least give a shot at it, is to say that one, Muslim has become racialized, and that even if it's not limited to just religion, you can argue, okay, it's against the Pakistanis, it's against the Arabs, because most of the images are of these kind of racialized, these racial brown, dark, bearded men who axiomatically, hate us. And so I don't accept the kind of this formalistic cop-out of, well, this is all about religion, we can't enforce Title VI. No, we can enforce it. The Civil Rights Division lawyers are fantastic. They're top of the line. I mean, I say that with utter honesty. And so I know that they can come up with a way. And also the DHS attorneys, the Office for Civil Rights needs to be a lot more aggressive in enforcing Title VI. Take away the money from the local police departments, these fusion centers who are spying on all of us. You know, the Mall of America case on NPR. Go on NPR September 7th and look at the Mall of America piece. They essentially are just creating one suspicious activity report after another for people who look nervous, who take pictures, who are drawing diagrams, and it's not Muslims, it's everybody else, including Muslims. So, you know, the chicken has come home to roost. Okay, that's all I have to say.
All right. Well, I'll just ask one final question for the panel. You know, if there was one thing you want to leave us here in the Civil Rights Division with as a charge, what would that be? And I know all of you have mentioned many things.
I'll let Saperstein go first.
I promise to do really quick, and just let me pick two things, you know, in this regard. The argument of national security, Dwight, I think skews things with analogies to other criminal activity. When the government can argue national security about a reason they do something that otherwise might seem to evoke a response of that stepping over a line, it kind of checks people from doing it because nobody wants to speak up against national security things. So there's an argument that one government has to be even more careful in those areas about it because of the intimidation. So you have the barbershop on one side here, but you also have the FBI going up to an individual on the street asking questions to somebody who may have an immigration problem, may have a misdemeanor problem, may have something. They're not sure what they can say. They're not sure what they can do. I'm not saying there's an easy answer to it, but ignoring how intimidating that can be, how frightening that can be to someone, I think it's something we have to grapple with. And the other thing I really would like to see dealt with better, I don't know, the Civil Rights Division here, is the question of charity and giving to charities, particularly charities that give to international relief. This is a very serious problem for Muslims who believe zakat requires them to be supporting certain things, and they are so unsure of what to do. What they can do, what they can't do, what can get them into trouble, what won't get them, how to avoid getting into trouble, et cetera, that it really creates this massive uncertainty. And I think that the government and the Muslim community together can really work to address that.
I'm told 30 seconds for each person.
Because I have to leave myself. I would like this first to thank the division for this forum. We need more of this forum, number one. Number two, I think the interagency meeting that I mentioned earlier, very beneficial. I would like to see more of that. And lastly, I would like to see a brochure speak about freedom of speech. Because people worried, if I criticize the government and the foreign policy at the so and that indicators, what am I in trouble? We need to ensure the Muslim community that they can speak their mind, they can engage in dissent from the government without fear.
I work with Tom, so it's not really my job to tell him what to do. But I will say that I will say anyway. What I want the civil rights to do is to continue doing everything they can to make sure we're fulfilling Bobby Kennedy's promise. And I wanted to do it because I think it's both right for civil rights, but it also makes us stronger as a country and stronger and safer.
I would like to see continued and more focus on systemic litigation and high-impact litigation, and particularly the cases that may bring some bad publicity, because that usually means there's a sore spot there. And I would just want to claim the Civil Rights Division, for its recent case in the Berkeley School District case, which I think sent a really good message, precedent, and deterrence for future school districts. Thank you.
Please
more
join me in
of Eric
thanking.
Train, too.
I'm sorry.
More of Eric Train and Mazen.
Please join me in thanking the panel.
My name is Roger Fairfax, and I'm a member of the faculty here at George Washington University Law School, one of the co-organizers of this event. And on behalf of the entire GW community, I want to thank those assembled here for their time and their attention to these important issues. Thank you to Deputy Attorney General James Cole and George Washington University Law School Dean Paul Schiff Berman for their earlier remarks, and also thanks as well to the distinguished panelists and moderators who participated today, and to Dr. Scott Keeter and Dr. Gregory Smith for their thought-provoking presentation on the Pew Survey results. I would also like to acknowledge the many people at the United States Department of Justice and the George Washington University who made this event possible today. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Roy Austin, a man of great talent and boundless energy, who led a terrific team at DOJ, including Albert Buckwalter, Tova Calderon, Ellen Engel, Albert Gilbert, Justin Fields Gray, Dory Henry, Sochi Hinojosa, Jay Kim, Connie Lee, Matt Nosanchuk, Thomas Skeeter, and last but certainly not least, Eric Treen, Special Counsel for Religious Discrimination, who was instrumental in bringing about today's event. And I know that there were many others who pitched in here at the event and helped it to run smoothly, so thank you as well. And on the GW team, we had Natalie Fields, who's the law school's conference coordinator. We had Laura Ewald and Kate Harlander-Locke, Karen Alton, and Claire Dugan of the law school's communications office, which was so helpful with logistics and publicity. And Deans Hank Molinango, Tom Morrison, and Monica Monroe, who helped to coordinate financial and other support for the event. Finally, Tracy Betancourt, Lily Ray, and Jason Moore, and the rest of the talented Jack Borden Auditorium staff, along with the GW University Police Department. I want to thank you for all of your hard work, and also to all of the student, staff, and faculty from GW in attendance. And on behalf, yes, absolutely. And on behalf of the university, I want to invite all of the attendees to a reception immediately following Mr. Perez's remarks. And I'm told by Deputy Assistant Attorney General Roy Austin that Mr. Perez just celebrated what he described as a milestone birthday. I'm not going to ask. I would guess 30, but we can take that opportunity to toast Mr. Perez for his birthday upstairs immediately following his remarks. Now, it's my tremendous honor to introduce my friend, Tom Perez, the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And Mr. Perez was nominated by President Obama and sworn in as AAG 2 years ago. And however, he's spent his entire career in public service on the federal, state, and local levels. Indeed, Mr. Perez has his career roots right in the very Civil Rights Division he now leads. He once worked as a federal prosecutor in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, where he prosecuted civil rights crimes and hate crimes, and later served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division under Attorney General Janet Reno. He also served as special counsel to the late Senator Edward Kennedy, acting as the senator's principal advisor on civil rights and criminal justice and constitutional issues, and later served as the director of the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration. Just prior to taking on his current position, Mr. Perez served as Secretary of the Department of Labor, Licensing, and Regulation in the state of Maryland. And in 2002, he was the first Latino ever elected to the County Council for Montgomery County, Maryland, the state's largest jurisdiction. And he later became president of that council. He received his bachelor's degree from Brown University, his MPP from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and his JD from Harvard Law School. And he's also served as a full-time law professor at the University of Maryland School of Law and a part-time professor at GW's School of Public Health right here on campus. Now, one item that seems to have been omitted from his official biography is his tremendously successful tenure as a youth girls basketball coach in Montgomery County. And I know about that because I had the pleasure, or I might want to say the misfortune, of coaching a rival team in that same league. We each coached our respective daughters' teams. And as such, I had the occasion to learn firsthand that the tenacity and focus and dedication that Tom has displayed throughout his career fighting for equality and justice were on equal display on the basketball court in coaching his fourth grade team, which I recall as having a fierce attitude. They were disciplined, and of course, they were supremely well coached. And it was the most well coached group of 9-year-olds I'd ever witnessed. So it's wonderful to see that someone as important and as influential as Tom Perez is so down to earth and gives back to his community in so many different ways. But even with all his many accomplishments, and there are many, Tom's most impressive qualities, in my view, are his generosity, his decency, his compassion, and his deeply held belief in the enduring principles upon which this great nation was founded. And all of these make him uniquely qualified and ideally positioned to lead the Civil Rights Division in tackling the vital issues we discuss here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Tom Perez.
Thank you, Larry.